Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing André Pagliarini. He is an assistant professor of history and a fellow in the Wilson Center for Leadership and Public Interest at Hampden-Sydney College in Central Virginia. He has written widely on Brazil for scholarly and academic audiences and outlets such as the Latin American Research Review, Latin American Perspectives, the New York Times, and the Guardian, as well as the Folha de Paulo and Piauí in Brazil. He is a 2022-24 Research Fellow at the Washington Brazil office, where he co-edits the weekly newsletter. He is also a non-resident expert at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. A 2022-23 Fulbright scholar, he is currently working on 3 book manuscripts, one on nationalism in Brazil, another on Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and a third on mass politics across post-independence Latin America. André, welcome once again to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me back for another round. I can't imagine anybody I'd rather be talking about Brazil with right now than you. So thank you.
So let's go right into the story today. I'd like you to give us an overview of Lula's first 100 days as president. What has been remarkable in those first 3 months of his administration, in your opinion, and what have been the challenges?
One of the things I've really liked about co-editing the weekly newsletter and writing a kind of editorial each week is that it's really trained me, I think, to think narratively about current events that happen week to week. So I've following even before the election, during the campaign, and now with the election, I find myself thinking about characters and storylines that is really been a nice way to follow events. So one thing I would emphasize is that the campaign was incredibly polarized one, and that polarization certainly carries over into the first 100 days of the administration. But one thing I would note that I think is worth paying attention to is the fact that the election was very, very close between Bolsonaro and Lula, and yet Lula was the first person to unseat an incumbent president since presidents could seek a second term. So I think that we have to keep that in mind when we think about Lula's standing. Yes, the election was close, but he accomplished something pretty remarkable and unprecedented in winning in the first place, which leads me to a second point that I would draw our attention to, which is that he remains, despite a rough week here and there, and potentially a misstatement here or there, quite popular. Recent polls suggest that he's not quite as popular as he was at this point in his first stint in office, but he's still more popular than Bolsonaro, which I think for the administration bodes well for the political struggles ahead. Is that he has emerged from January 8th, right? This really anti-institutional radical attempt to tar the new administration on relatively solid political footing. And so I think that that's an important place to be 100 days after inauguration, setting the stage for the struggles ahead this year.
So what do you think he's accomplished in these first 100 days?
First, I think, is to restore a sense of normalcy, to the country's politics, by which I mean, putting together an administration that represents different tendencies, different forces in Brazilian political life. Now, there's a way in which I think rightfully many people understand that to be shady or dirty or corrupt, handing out political positions to different political parties, not for the sake of ideological alignment, but just to get things done. But one thing I think Lula is really careful about, and he was during the campaign as well, to say, these are the political forces as they currently exist. These are the forces I must negotiate with, that he would say, am pretty good at negotiating with, towards accomplishing a set agenda of progressive aims. I think articulating that in the way that he has and demonstrating that it's possible and it can be done after years of Bolsonaro, failing at almost every turn to compromise, to negotiate, to convince, right? Bolsonaro would just anybody who was not as radical as him, he couldn't work with. And so I think there's a kind of modeling that Lula is doing of how you govern in a country that's politically divided into many parties. So that's one thing I think has been a real accomplishment from the modeling aspect after the sort of disorder of the Bolsonaro years. In material terms, reviving a lot of the programs that were successful during his administration. Bolsa Familia is back under its original name. Minha Casa Minha Vida, these housing program that was remarkably successful in giving homes to lower income people. Now, this is 100 days in, right? There are plenty of, I think, cautious criticism that say, well, it can't just be that. Right? It's not enough to sort of revive these successful programs from last time. What is the new horizon for new social policies? But 100 days in, I think that's a lot, right? In the fragmented political climate right now in Brazil, accomplishing these things, like winning an election against an incumbent, is really no small feat. Maintaining a sense of institutional normalcy after January 8th, when things might have really gotten ugly, I think reflects a really well-selected cabinet in really important positions. Justice Minister Flávio Dino, I think, when the history is written of this period in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, might emerge as one of the most important choices that I think has done, by most standards, a really an effective job of holding the country's institutions together.
So the economy is seen as one of the trickiest areas for the new government. So how do you see the government's actions up to now in this area, including the recent announcement of a new fiscal framework?
As an economic layperson, I find the arguments for the new arcabouço fiscal, the new kind of fiscal framework, to make intuitive sense, even though there are some within the Workers' Party who snipe at it for several reasons that I'll mention. The argument for the need for a new fiscal framework is, I think, political and economic. The political argument is that the teto fiscal, the ceiling on federal spending imposed under Michel Temer, lacked democratic legitimacy. This is the political argument, that Michel Temer came to office under, at best, dubious legitimacy, with the best dubious legitimacy, having not won an election and conspired against the elected president, Dilma Rousseff. That teto de gastos, the spending cap, was really draconian. Even its supporters will say it's draconian as part of its virtue. They'll say it really impedes government spending from rising year to year. Government spending can only go up at the rate of inflation, which effectively means you're not able, if you're in power, to address a need as it arises because you're capped at inflation. So there's a political argument for the new arcabouço fiscal, which does allow for rises above inflation. It gives the government some discretion to enact its own policy vision, whereas the previous one hamstrung them. The economic argument is that it's basically an anti-cyclical one, right? It's based on a kind of social democratic Keynesian argument that is largely accepted. It's not even controversial in many advanced economies, which is that, in a period of economic downturn, the government should be able to spend more to increase demand, to keep the economy moving. And in periods of economic growth, the government can afford to limit or reduce somewhat its spending. So the arcabouço fiscal is, Finance Minister Fernando Haddad said this from the beginning, even before it was introduced, is that that's basically going to be the framework. Basic social democratic budget management. Now, some of the Workers' Party say that the fact that it does include mechanisms to cut spending or to cap spending in certain areas makes it insufficiently flexible, makes it insufficiently anti-cyclical, I suppose. But I think Haddad is really walking this tightrope of appealing to an electorate, a base of the electorate, but also politicians, left-wing politicians, who want the government to do more, to do big things, and to spend money, and to do these lofty projects, which I think the PT has shown, the Workers' Party has shown, it knows how to do. It can do them quite well. First is another constituency he has to mollify, which is more conservative politically, but also economically, banking sectors, foreign investors who worry about the long-term state of the Brazilian economy. If spending, for example, goes out of control and inflation arises, what does that mean for my investment? If I'm a US corporation, for example, is that at risk? And so it sounds like Haddad, given the reception of the new plan in Faria Lima, which is Brazil's sort of Wall Street equivalent, it was been largely well received as, from their point of view, a kind of best case scenario of a Lula administration fiscal plan that they seem to be able to live with from coverage of this. Which is not to say there isn't flank from his left, right? There was an interview recently with Lindbergh Farias, who was a prominent Workers' Party elected official, who says that Haddad is appealing too much to that other sector. So this will be, 100 days in, Haddad has managed to introduce an ambitious plan that satisfies diverse constituencies when it comes to economic management. There's no guarantee that he'll be able to hold both sides in a kind of balance, those who are more in favor of an expansive spending program and one that says you need to really be careful about in creating new programs, for example.
So one of the expectations from the Lula government in comparison to Bolsonaro was his U-turn in an approach towards the environment and indigenous issues. How do you see Lula's performance in these areas so far?
So it's no secret that I am, generally supportive of the Lula's campaign, and I spoke with friends and family all about about this. And one of the things I heard the most as a criticism of this early period is an argument after the first month, for example. I think it was at the end of January or maybe the end of February when headlines were showing a record level of deforestation in parts of the Amazon. They said, well, see, wasn't he supposed to fix this? And I said to them, look, if in 30 days, Lula had been able to dismantle or to close the Pandora's box that Bolsonaro opened in the Amazon, that would be really miraculous. If we're still hitting records in the last month of his term, I'll agree with you that it's been a disaster. But 30 months in, they were finding
30 days.
30 days in, 30 days in, it does not surprise me that the scale of illegal mining, of illegal deforestation, finding networks of hidden landing strips in the Amazon, machinery in the Amazon. This is a long-term problem to deal with. Now, in his previous stint in office, Lula has shown, and I think this is in part why the return of Minister Marina Silva was a good indication, is that she oversaw the Ministry of the Environment previously, that they are able, the Brazilian government is able to drastically rein in deforestation. I think that's important to shout from the mountaintops, right? It has the technical capability, it has the institutional capability, it has the government agencies to do that. What has lacked in the past is political will. So during the Bolsonaro administration, for example, there were suggestions from French President Emmanuel Macron, for example, among other scholars and such that said if Brazil can't or won't guard against deforestation, the international community perhaps should consider it. And Bolsonaro was able to puff up his chest and say that Amazon is ours and all of that. And I think on that point, he struck a political nerve across left and right in Brazil. Of course, he failed to take any action. I mean, the laws in Brazil regarding the environment are quite good. They're very good laws in the books, but they're only as good as their enforcement. So enforcing these regulations, I think, will be a huge first step, but it involves continued, commitment. Marina Silva, in these first 100 days, has been very prominent. She's traveled abroad. She's had many high-level negotiations with, for example, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry. But I think if not for, say, January 8th, if not for some of these other institutional challenges, she might have an even bigger role in the government. So I think it's been a major part of Lula's narrative in these first 100 days about returning the priority to environmental regulation, but perhaps not as much as initially expected, given that the country, came closer than many even feared to an institutional break. And so I think that's consumed a lot of the attention domestically and internationally. But I'm hoping that the environmental angle to Lula's administration will become a central storyline that it can and should be. It could be a great success story.
And what about his policy towards indigenous peoples of Brazil? How has that changed, and what's been significant about that?
So this too was one of those areas that was even worse than expected when they came to power. There, images of Yanomami people, of children, starving, their waterways contaminated as part of this Pandora's box of what happens when you effectively refuse to enforce environmental regulations, is that it led to all kinds of new mining operations that poisoned waterways, that really just ghastly stories of indigenous girls, falling prey to lawless miners and loggers and so on, with very little state involvement in helping and policing these areas. Indigenous children in these remote parts. That, again, I think part of what the story that's often told is that these are remote parts of the country and they're very hard to reach. And that's true in part, but where there's a profit motive, you better believe at the Bolsonaro Year show, there are people there. There is an apparatus there. There's no reason the government shouldn't be there as well to protect these Brazilian citizens as well. So I think, from the level of political rhetoric, that's certainly been a part of what we've seen so far from Lula administration reinforcing its commitment to these parts of the national territory in ways that were abandoned under Bolsonaro. And we've seen that reassertion of the state dramatically improving the lives of many people in these remote parts of the rainforest, for example. Now, it's still a real challenge. It's still 100 days is not a lot of time considering the kind of damage that was allowed to occur there. But, I think unlike Bolsonaro, indigenous groups, for example, Minister Sonia Guajajara, the Minister of Indigenous Peoples, this is an administration that they're not actively fighting, right? That they're not actively pushing against. The Lula administration, I think, one could say a lot of things, but they are committed to the environmental cause and to the cause of indigenous peoples. I think that that's a real commitment that Lula, I am certain, a year from now, 2 years from now, will say, hold me to that promise. How am I doing in that regard? And I think I am confident it will be a better picture, which is not that comforting in the short term, right? But as a matter of national government policy, I think we're seeing the bases for a much better picture in the years ahead.
So let's go into the area of the international arena, foreign relations, which have changed radically as well from the Bolsonaro to the Lula administration. What would you say are the highlights in this area? What's important to have to look at and to evaluate?
One thing that I think is clear is that Brazil is, again, the subject of international attention, and not in a negative way, by which I mean it's clear that the United States, China, European Union want to engage with Brazil, which I see as aside from individual issues, I see that as a general good. It's good for Brazil. It's good for the world when Brazil is an active, constructive partner. Bolsonaro, for ideological reasons, for political reasons, simply had no interest in being a constructive partner in service of an international agenda of generally progressive aims, by which I mean, human rights, environmental protection. There is generally speaking, a consensus agenda, I think we can speak of on matters, for example, of climate that is emerging between elected governments in much of the world. Bolsonaro was totally a pariah on those issues, was totally against the grain on those issues. In fact, his foreign minister, Bolsonaro's foreign minister, his minister of the environment, argued that consensus, for example, that the world should move to a greener economy, represented a kind of communist plot that Brazil refused to be a part of. But the result of that, Brazil was completely isolated. No one wanted to be seen with Brazil. Nobody wanted to invite Brazil to anything. Brazil was more isolated than it had been in decades. The Bolsonaro argument was that this was a principled withdrawal in many ways, right? Ernesto Araújo, his foreign minister, said, then, you know what, then let us be pariahs. So I think one of the major turnarounds we've seen, maybe the quickest, the most immediate turnaround after Lula's inauguration, was the world saying it's good to have Brazil back as a reliable partner. That doesn't mean it's always been, sort of warm and fuzzy. I think Lula and President Joe Biden seem to have a pretty good personal rapport, but it doesn't mean that they're replicating the kind of closeness that Bolsonaro and Trump had by any means, by any stretch. So Lula, I think it's telling, for example, that he came to the United States and spent, I think, just over 48 hours on that visit, whereas he's going to China, I believe, next week for a week. That tells us where
you can make an argument about jet lag and needing a little bit more time to adjust between. Right, right. That's
a great point.
To be fair,
right? That's a great point. It's a longer trip, and like my mother always says, if you're making a long trip, make it worth your while. Stay there a bit. So that's fair. It's also reflective of the fact that China has surpassed the United States as Brazil's #1 trade partner, and that more trade is always good. But I think it's also indicative of a confident Brazil, right? An assertive Brazil that, unlike the Bolsonaro years, sees for itself a prime role on the world stage. Lula, going back to his first stint in office, and I would argue reflecting a trend that goes back decades in Brazilian life, in Brazilian diplomacy, that says Brazil is not a small country. It's not an insignificant country. It should be a part of major international decisions. It should have a role in major international questions. So major international question of the day today, the war in Ukraine, for example. So there are many in Brazil and internationally who will say Brazil is out of its depth diplomatically in trying to mediate a potential solution. Lula has insisted that the invasion of Ukraine was wrong, that Putin should not have done that. But he's also critical of what he sees as a kind of provocative encirclement of Russia by NATO forces that places at least some of the blame on Western Europe and the NATO alliance. Whatever one thinks of that argument, Brazil is once again a relevant actor in international affairs. It's widely expected that Lula and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping will present a kind of peace framework for the war in Ukraine, for example. So diplomatically, very quickly, within 100 days, Brazil has returned as a prominent power in the world stage. One that I think it's important to note is explicitly, openly democratic. Right? Lula is not Maduro. He's not Ortega. He's committed to democracy, multi-party elections, openness, and so on. So I think it's important that he has presented himself as a reliable democratic partner that will side with the United States when appropriate, but not in every instance. I think this is an important. Yeah.
You mentioned Venezuela, you mentioned Nicaragua, you didn't mention Cuba, which are the three countries in Latin America that the United States point to as being authoritarian and undemocratic, and an historic connection that the left in Brazil has had with those countries historically when one could argue a progressive agenda was being carried out in some of those countries. What do you see as this situation now between having connections with these leftist or post-leftist regimes in Latin America, and also a connection with Russia and China? Well, how do we understand that?
I think there are at least two things going on there. One is, I think it would be sort of impossible to deny a kind of generational element to this, where there is an older part of the Workers' Party, not exclusively, there are younger militants who feel this way too, but who have a kind of connection with Cuba, especially in Nicaragua as well, where the Sandinistas were a real, kind of a sense of cohort, as it were, with the emerging Workers' Party in Brazil and the Sandinista rebellion, the revolution there. So I think there's a generational argument that looks at these actors, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela to a lesser extent because it's more recent, of course, but even China and Russia, and says the United States has long said these are bad guys, these are international villains, and that the situation, at the very least, is more complicated than that. But on the second layer I would point out to this is that I think the Lula administration would argue diplomatically, Brazil gains little, and the international order gains little by Brazil adding its voice to the chorus of denunciation. That nothing's, what does it change in the political situation of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua if Brazil reiterates what the United States position is? I think it's hard to see what would be different. I think the wager of the diplomacy that we're seeing carried out now by Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira and Celso Amorim, as well as the special advisor to Lula, is that Brazil will kind of refrain from open criticism in order to preserve goodwill down the road to potentially mediate a solution of some kind. That by joining the chorus of denunciation, Brazil would cede that ability to mediate, as Bolsonaro did. Right? I mean, as Brazil under Bolsonaro had no capacity to deal with Maduro government in Venezuela, contributing to the isolation of Brazil diplomatically, and also to the ossification of these political systems that many on the left would argue have ceased to be democratic, in Nicaragua especially, for example. So I think it's part of this argument that Brazil can most effectively deploy its diplomatic assets if it's seen as a truly neutral arbiter. This is an argument they're making, right? There, some would say that that's naive, or that this is hiding some kind of ulterior authoritarianism. I think Lula, on the world stage now, after winning a close election against a guy who with openly authoritarian inclinations, says, I have the standing democratically to talk to Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, Russia, China, whoever, as an elected leader who takes seriously democracy, who always respected democratic outcomes when he lost. So don't accuse me, I think Lula would say, of authoritarianism, but I think there's a better way to negotiate and engage with these countries. As I say, it's an argument. And not every progressive leader in Latin America agrees with that approach, but it's certainly a key feature of these first 100 days.
And time will tell, certainly, on this question. How about Congress? How has Lula done so far in negotiating relations with Congress? He doesn't hold a majority. So how much compromise is going to be in the scenarios ahead? How is he going to be able to get his projects, his legislation approved?
Well, this comes back a little bit to the first point I was saying about Lula's ability to explain in a way to Brazilian voters, but also international observers, the particularities of the Brazilian system, right? Bolsonaro treated Congress as not a check or a co-equal branch of government, but as an obstacle in many cases to what he and his family were trying to sort of get away with in many cases. Lula has tried to argue that, look, we have to deal with who is there. He said during the campaign, if you elect me, you're electing, candidate X, Y, and Z. That's who I have to go negotiate with. So even as we're gearing up for major legislative procedures, and in addition to the fiscal law, there's a major tax reform that's coming down at some point this year. They're treating these negotiations that are going to happen with a sense of normalcy that I think is strategic, right? Lula is not, when it comes to Congress, saying all or nothing. It's my way, or he's being very cautious, differently than he is, for example, with the question of the central bank, where he's been much more combative. With Congress, he's taken a much more, we're going to talk to these people, we're going to negotiate, we're going to have them over, we're going to go line by line and work out difference by difference, which I think is strategic. And in fact, one could argue that it's paid some dividends, that diplomatic approach with Congress. So the Centrão has become this almost mythological force in the Brazilian legislature, which refers broadly to this large collection of parties and individual members of Congress who are part of not major parties, by which I mean clear ideological visions or clear issues, but largely exist to wield power, to win power, hold power, and perpetuate power. Arthur Lira, the Speaker of the lower house of Congress, is a kind of incarnation of this model. Doesn't really have a clear ideological agenda other than perpetuating himself in power and his allies. And Lula has negotiated with him. But I think one interesting wrinkle in these first 100 days is a split in the Centrão that's occurred with parties like the PSD, MDB, and maybe one or two others that are usually part of this big amorphous blob in the middle, breaking from Lira, who was more aligned with Bolsonaro, to support Lula more explicitly. So you have a situation where left-wing parties do not have a majority, but might be able to cobble enough of a majority from its base and parts of the Centrão that see in their political interests an alignment with Lula. And I think this is one of those elements that makes Lula unique, for better or for worse, right? Is his ability to schmooze and cobble together these coalitions in which other politicians, especially in such a polarized state, might not be able to. But I think, he hasn't cracked the code in these 100 days, but he's certainly pointed a way in which these lofty ambitions can make it through this Congress. And it's hard to imagine another leader of his camp, leftist, center left, achieving that at this point after 100 days. So it's promising.
So Lula has been demanding of his ministers that they put forth a positive agenda. Meanwhile, there's been a lot of criticism regarding the government's kind of errors or flawed communication strategy. What is your view of the new government's image? How's it doing in that front?
This is a great question. And I think one of the metrics by which we can evaluate that has to do with those poll results that I mentioned. I think we can at least say it's not a disaster. It's not bad, in part because the polls show that Lula remains a more popular leader than Bolsonaro, that more voters declare themselves petistas, PT supporters, than Bolsonaristas. I think if the government was absolutely falling on its face in these first 100 days, we might see those numbers look a little different. And I think this part of this has to do with Lula's singular political, personality. He is able to, for example, in the wake of tragedy in the state of São Paulo with Governor Tarcísio de Freitas, to convincingly, I think that's the trick, is convincingly signal a pause in political divisions. Because, a leader can give you sort of empty words about political unity and political this and that. But when Lula was up there in the wake of these horrible landslides and along the coast of São Paulo to say that in this moment, there is no political difference between Tarcísio and I. He won an election as the Bolsonaro candidate. I won an election as the opposition. Similar thing happened in the Northeast. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Pernambuco, where the governor recently elected is of the PSDB, who is a long-term, opponent of the Workers' Party. And the governor was booed at an event with Lula, and he very quickly said, not okay, right? We invited her here. She was elected. I was elected. We are adversaries. We're not enemies. My sense is that Brazilians are really, generally speaking, across the ideological spectrum, really ready for that kind of argument. And it's one that Lula has always embodied, right? That for all the caricature of him as a leftist, as a radical sort of firebrand, he's always been somebody looking to reach out to his political opponents. To the point where some people criticize him for this. Some people say he talks like a radical revolutionary, but he's very soft on the banks or whatever. But I think that's part of his political strength, is his ability to convincingly say in a campaign or in a debate, here is the problem, here's what I see as the issue, here are what I see as the culprits for the problems of the country, but then sit down and work with a diverse array of political actors in a way that might be unique, for better or for worse, because someday Lula won't be there. And is there anybody with that capacity to reach across ideological lines that he undoubtedly has? I saw an interview recently, or not an interview, it was a statement from historic figures of the PSDB, of the center-right, long-term opposition, of former President Fernando Henrique, for example, who said recently, after 100 days, he remains cautiously optimistic. Aloysio Nunes, another former senator, former foreign minister under Michel Temer, says he still considers himself a supporter of this government. He endorsed Lula. So I think that, the government couldn't be doing better in articulating some of its policies. For example, Lula got really mad when one of his ministers, Márcio França, the former governor of São Paulo, now the Secretary of Transport, if I'm not mistaken, kind of suggested, we have this policy where we're going to subsidize poor people, working people, students to fly on airplanes. for cheaper rates. And Lula was not happy about that because it had not gone through the proper channels of communication. And a lot of people laughed at the idea. So there are these minor sort of hiccups. But I think the broad image of a government committed to democracy, committed to dialogue, I think is the prevailing narrative after these 100 days.
So amidst all of the challenges that Lula is facing, there's an indisputable fact that Bolsonaro left the government in shambles. How much has this affected the Lula government's capacity to operate and to deliver?
My sense is that Lula has gotten a great degree of forbearance in a lot of ways in these first 100 days because of the shape that Bolsonaro left the country in, because of January 8th, which was clearly, despite some conspiracy theories online, driven by the president's Bolsonaro supporters. But also, thirdly, the fact that Bolsonaro couldn't be bothered to stay in the country, to follow or to accompany developments after he left. I really think they underestimated, Bolsonaro and his close allies underestimated the toll that would take on him politically, leaving the country for as long as he did. And part of it gets back to a comment I made earlier, which is that Bolsonaro, I think, throughout his political career, has mostly been disinterested in politics that don't affect him directly, him or his family directly, or his direct political constituency, of police officers and military officers. If it's not really related to those, I think he struggles to be invested in them. And so having lost power, does he really care about Lula's cabinet and these early debates over economic policy? Not to the extent that it doesn't affect him, I don't think. And I think that really disappointed a lot of his supporters who, for some reason, believed that he was a statesman or that he could be a statesman. So I've heard anecdotally from plenty of people who supported him in 2018 and 22 who said, this guy is not the statesman that I thought he was, that he is really craven and self-interested. Now, that's not everybody. He still, I think, remains a potent political force, but I think a really reduced one. And that has, I think, given Lula a certain grace period with some voters who might not be aligned with him ideologically, but who said, look, I didn't vote for Lula. I wouldn't have voted for Lula, but Bolsonaro clearly left a mess and couldn't be bothered to help or couldn't be bothered to assist in an institutional transition. And so I have a feeling, and it's mostly a feeling, that has helped the Lula government weather some of this polarization. I think even people who voted for Bolsonaro in 18 and 22 will say that the country was left in, let's say, less than ideal circumstances. So I think politically that has helped a little bit.
So if Bolsonaro misstepped in staying out of the country and not being in Brazil as a leader, how strong is he as a political force, and where is the far right at this moment in Brazil? Is it on the rise? Is it on the defensive? Is it staying in place? What's your analysis of the oppositional forces of the extreme right in Brazil against the current government?
The sense is that he really burned himself by being gone that long. Because, if we think about Bolsonaro's appeal in 2018, 2017, in the wake of the impeachment, it's that there was nobody to his right. There was nobody more against the system. There was nobody more against the PT. There was nobody more, open in their disdain for the status quo of successive elections won by the Workers' Party, for example. I think him leaving the country really raised a question of, well, wait a minute, now his followers are outside military barracks, is calling for an intervention. Where's the leader? All of a sudden, he's not leading the most right-wing elements, most reactionary elements. In fact, they see themselves leaderless without him. And I wonder, a major question in the years to come will be whether he can reconstruct that image of someone who leads reactionary forces as opposed to trying to chase them. So that'll be an interesting question to watch. There are other figures, right? Tarcísio in São Paulo, who I mentioned, Romeu Zema, the governor of Minas Gerais, who at first glance strike me as potential national leaders. But, I here to make a comparison with the United States, they strike me as people trying to capture within the Republican Party some of that Trump without Trump, the Trumpist appeal without some of the baggage. And I'm not sure the appeal comes without the baggage. I'm not sure, for many Brazilian conservative right-wing voters, part of the appeal of Bolsonaro was that he was anti-institutional, that he, said the dictatorship was not brutal enough, that the institutions of post-1988 were flawed and irredeemably so. That's the appeal, I think, for a lot of people. So for someone like Tarcísio, who, had spent a long career as a kind of bureaucrat, a serious sort of infrastructure person, I think he just doesn't have that disposition to be the rabble rouser. We saw this in his debates with Fernando Haddad for the governor of São Paulo. In fact, I think that's part of, one of the things that helped him prevail against Haddad, who was also mild-mannered, is that he's a kind of mild-mannered guy. He doesn't have that disposition. So the open question then is whether Bolsonaro can present himself again as the bleeding edge of the right in Brazil. He might be able to, because I don't see people willing to go as far. But could legal trouble disrupt that process? It's not clear to me that his own party is totally behind him. I mean, Bolsonaro, like in a way, Jânio Quadros way back in the early 1960s, right? He was a disruptive force in some ways that prevented, I think, the formation of long-term allies. So these are things to watch out for. I don't see someone emerging from the ashes of Bolsonarismo that will have national appeal. There are certainly figures who have emerged. Congressman Nicolás Ferreira, for example, from Minas Gerais, who was a young, social media savvy, really, anti-trans, particular homophobic figure who might build a following. But looking at them, it's like looking at Bolsonaro in the early 90s. From the ashes of military rule, here was this figure saying these crazy things. I think someone like Nicolás Ferreira is now in the ashes of Bolsonarismo, trying to build a political career out of that. And it's not clear to me, considering Bolsonaro's return to Brazil was not the big, huge event he hoped for, that there's a path in this new political climate for a Bolsonaro revival. Not to say he won't be significant. He has a hard core of support, but I'm not sure it's the rhetoric, the appeal he offers is still the dominant refrain of Brazilian politics. I don't think it is.
So, André, any other thing you'd like to comment about the first 100 days of Lula in power before we end this wonderful conversation?
I think, 100 days is one of these milestones that is important. We think about it in the context of FDR, of American President Franklin Roosevelt, taking power in the depths of the Great Depression, arguing that in those first 100 days, he would take a series of measures to begin reversing the fortunes of the country. And of course, he would become one of the most successful elected officials in the history of the United States, winning successive elections. So as a metric, I think 100 days is a useful symbolism. And I think for anyone who cares about environmental policy, human rights, the ability of the Brazilian government to care for its citizens in material terms, it's been a successful 100 days. I think it's important to remember Brazil is not a poor country. It can do big things. It can do, innovative social policies. It can reduce deforestation, inequality, all these things. What it lacked under Bolsonaro was political will. So 100 days in, we've seen a government with the political will, I would argue with the political skill needed to not only reverse the damage of Bolsonaro, but to really begin to make Brazil a more equal, a better place to live for the vast majority of the country than it's been in the recent past. And I think that's the bar Lula has set for himself. So I think he will welcome in the next 100 days and the 100 days after that, being held to that standard. Is Brazil a better place to live for the vast majority of the country? And I think in 4 years' time, that'll be the question to ask. And I'm hoping if the past is any indication, the answer will be positive.
Wow, Andrea, I really am glad you were able to join us today on Brazil Unfiltered. Thank you for coming.
It's my enormous pleasure, Jim, always.
So I hope you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is sponsored by the Washington Brazil office. Our executive producer and editor is Camilo Rocha. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you are already listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.